Hey Dave, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. So we are live now. I'll wait for another minute to introduce you, but good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. How you been?
Yeah, good, good. I'm working out of the Science Center today.
Ah, okay.
So I moved recently and I only have white walls and it's not great for the, you know, background experience. So here we are.
Where'd you move to?
In West Philly. I just bought a house actually.
Oh,
Hi everyone.
congratulations.
Thank you. Everyone who's watching now, you know I bought a house. Yeah. Yeah. And where are you?
So I'm in media. Just
Okay, yeah.
yeah.
Nice, nice. I grew up in Westchester.
Oh,
I
cool.
guess yeah. I'll so we can see how many people are viewing. I will give us well, I'll introduce you because you're really the focus of this session. Hi everybody who is here. My name is Julie Zegley. I'm technically the managing editor. I am your session moderator. Hi Suzanne, thank you for joining from Think Company. So we are here with David Dylan Thomas. He is a content strategy advocate with Think Company. This session is a workshop. It is called Design for Cognitive Bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. From the very beginning of your product and company strategy, you must consider a far wider array of needs and users. This will dive deeply into how to build inclusive practices in larger design strategy. Dave also recently wrote a book. It is called, and so I'm sure that a lot of the lessons that are featured in that book will be discussed here. So take it away, Dave.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the Introduced conference and technically for having me. Gonna share my screen now, and hopefully y'all can see this. Can everybody see the Design for Cognitive Bias slide up now? Yes. Okay, so we'll get started. So this is Design for Cognitive Bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. We can talk about how to use them for evil, but I think we already have a pretty good idea how that works. So my name is David Dylan Thomas, content strategy advocate at Think Company and the author of Design for Cognitive Bias, which is out now from a book apart. The road to writing this book started with a podcast I used to do, and I've started doing again, called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. And this podcast started with this woman here. Her name is Iris Bonnet. She gave a talk called Gender Equality by Design at South by Southwest a few years ago, and it blew my mind. She was basically putting down that a lot of implicit bias, gender bias, racial bias boiled down to pattern recognition. As soon as I saw that, right, this idea that, let's say you're hiring a web developer, and the image that might pop into your head as soon as I say those words might be skinny white dude, right? And it's not because you explicitly believe that men are better at programming than women, far from it, but the pattern that's been set up in your life from movies, television, maybe offices you've worked in is that pattern. And so if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit the pattern, you start to get skeptical without even realizing it. When I saw that something as terrible as racial or gender bias could come down to something as simple and, dare I say, human as pattern recognition, I decided I needed to learn everything I possibly could about cognitive bias. And so I did. This is a list of cognitive biases from the Rational Wiki. There's well over 150 of them. And I realized I was not going to figure that all out in one day. So I decided to take one a day. And then this inevitably turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And so my friends said, Dave, please just get a podcast. Now it's worth settling what is cognitive bias. And at the end of the day, it's really just a set of shortcuts your mind is taking just to get through the day. You have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about how fast to talk, what to do with my hands, where to look. And if I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that our minds are usually on autopilot, but occasionally the autopilot gets it wrong. And we call those mistakes biases. Here's a fun one. It's called illusion of control. And it happens when you're playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you need a high number, you might roll that die really hard. If you need a lower number, you might roll it kind of gently, right? And you know that it makes no difference how hard you roll the die, but we like to think we have control in situations where we have no control. And so we embody that by how hard we throw the die. This one's not so harmless. It's called confirmation bias. And you can see this happen when you have an idea that you just can't get out of your head. And if you see evidence that contradicts the idea, you ignore that and you only look for evidence to support the idea. Sorry, not sure where that's coming from. So no matter what happens, you decide that you're going to believe in that idea. You only look for evidence that supports it. And if anything comes along that contradicts the idea, you say fake news and you move on. We saw an example of this during the Iraq War, when the whole idea was we had to go into Iraq because Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And we need to get him before he gets us. Seemed very compelling. Within a year, the president of the United States, who initially said we have to go in, said, oh yeah, we didn't find anything. Regardless, people still believed that there were weapons of mass destruction. There's so much so that if you fast forward to 2015, still 50% of Republicans and 36% of Democrats still believed that, yes, there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So this is a very persistent bias, and we'll be coming back to it. Now, these biases are extremely difficult to combat. Part of the reason is you may not even realize that you have the bias. There's a bias called the bias blind spot. And it's where you think you don't have any biases, but you're sure everybody else does. Part of the reason it's hard to spot is that about 95% of cognition is happening below the threshold of conscious thought. You're making decisions so quickly, your mind doesn't even register them. So if somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you do know, you do it anyway, right? There's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could ask everybody on this call, write down the last two numbers of your phone number. And then I could say, we're going to bid on a bottle of wine. And those of you who wrote down a lower number are going to bid lower. Those of you who wrote down a higher number are going to bid higher. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. Now, I could start that experiment and tell you about anchoring and say, hey, you're going to do this thing. It's really dumb. Don't do it. You probably still do it. In fact, I could say, hey, here's this thing called anchoring. Here's how it works. I will pay you cash money not to do it. You are still likely to do it. Now, the reason we need to be concerned about cognitive bias is a thing called choice architecture. And you can see it play out if you go buy groceries, right? If you buy produce. You always reach from the top of the barrel because that's where the grocer is going to put the product they're most trying to move, right? The older product. Now, they've architected that situation to benefit themselves, right? Because they know people are going to reach for what's right in front of them. They could just as easily architect that situation to benefit the customer, right? And put the freshest produce where it's easiest to reach. The point is, the way the situation is architected affects our decisions. Now, think about the decisions your user or your customer needs to make. Then think about how people make decisions, right? Not the way we think they do, which is rationally, but the way they actually do, which is 95% of the time without even realizing how they're doing it. And there are content and design choices we can make that can help keep harmful cognitive biases at bay, or maybe even use them for good. Let's go back to that skinny white dude, right? So as it turns out, if you have two identical resumes, right, and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, the one that has a male name is more likely to move up the chain. The one that has a female name is more likely to stay on the pile. But here's the thing. Why do you need that information, right? What about the name is helping you decide who to hire? Think of it like a signal-to-noise problem, right? The signal qualification is the experience. The noise, right, is the gender or the race or whatever you're reading into the gender and the race. Now, the city of Philadelphia did, in fact, do a round of blind hiring for a web developer position. And a couple of things they discovered. One, the best way to anonymize a resume, even in the high-tech world of web development, is to physically print it out and have an intern basically take a marker and redact it like a CIA document. Another thing they found out pretty quickly is that they would see a resume they liked, and then they'd want to go on GitHub to see that developer's profiles, kind of their portfolio. Problem is, as soon as they went to GitHub, the profile would load and they would see all the personal information for that developer, and it would ruin the experiment. So clever people that they are, they wrote a Chrome plugin, right? A program that would eliminate all the personal information as the page loaded. And just to complete the circle, they then went back and put that code back on GitHub. So it's there now if you ever want to try it out yourself. Now, this isn't just about making humans do hiring decisions. This is about robots too. So a little while ago, Amazon had a hiring bot that was meant to help, recruiters figure out who to hire. The problem was it was extremely sexist, so sexist that if it saw the name of a woman's college on a resume, it would in fact downgrade that resume. So they went back to try to figure out how did this program get so biased? So they looked and asked themselves, how did we train the AI? And they trained it on the previous 10 years worth of resumes. Guess what most of those resumes had in common? They were mostly coming from guys. So the AI took one look at that, said, gee, sure must like dudes, and then just kept recommending guys. And that's the point. We think the way to train AI is to point at the world we have so it can make better predictions about the future. The problem with that is, if you point an AI at a racist, sexist world, it is going to make racist, sexist predictions. I'm almost of the opinion that we should actually start lying to AI. Now, this can go the other way. Amazon Go is a store where you just walk in, take what you want, and you leave, because Amazon is auto-magically deducting all of those products from your account. Ashley Clark Thompson wrote about this in CNET and called the article, "In Amazon Go, No One Thinks I'm Stealing." And what she was talking about is a phenomenon known as shopping while black, which manifests as hyper-aggressive customer service. Can I help you? Can I help you? No, really, can I help you? Ashley Clark Thompson experienced none of this in the Amazon Go store because there was no one to do that to her. She could shop freely. Because Amazon removed one design element, namely the employees, she was able to have a less biased shopping experience. We're even seeing this play out in the justice system. So San Francisco recently created a situation where the district attorney, when deciding whether or not to bring charges, because if you don't know, that is a leeway that district attorneys have. They can decide whether or not to bring charges. They have a huge leeway there. And they were typically bringing charges when the offender was black and not so much when the offender was white. So they said, well, why do you even need that information in the crime report? Let's eliminate for the offenders, the race, the gender, same for the victims. Oh, and by the way, let's also remove the location, because that could be biasing as well. So they just started this experiment last summer. I do not know what the results are yet, but I think it's an interesting attempt. A really important bias to understand is called cognitive fluency. And it's the idea that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, we will assume whatever it's talking about is also going to be easy to do. By the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, we'll assume whatever it's talking about is also going to be hard to do. Now, this is a recipe for pancakes. I love making pancakes. If I took a glance at this, right, with the text being kind of small and clumped together, I might assume, you know what? I bet pancakes are hard to make. I don't know if I'm going to make pancakes. Show me the same thing with nice big photography and small little bursts of text. I might assume, you know what? I bet pancakes aren't that hard to make. I think I'll make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget about it. We're making pancakes. Now, when this comes to public transportation, I'm sitting here in media and I want to take public transportation to get to Philly. I take one look at that schedule, the printed schedule, and I conclude public transportation must be impossible. I'm going to drive. I take a look at that app, right? And I haven't read anything yet, but at a glance, I think, you know what? I bet public transportation isn't that hard. Now, I'll let you all vote in your hearts since I can't see you. How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? And how many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914? You're both wrong. She was born in 1913, but many people choose 1914. And the reason is, if something is easier to read, we actually assume it's more true. But it gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. Now, what we think is going on here is that things that are easy to process feel more certain. All the biases I look at, they all are basically shortcuts to certainty. We love certainty, we hate uncertainty. Things that are easy to remember, easy to process, feel more certain. I'll give you an example. If I ask you, what did you get for your 5th birthday? You might say, oh, I'm not sure. If I said, you got a toy truck, right? You might say, I don't feel certain about that. It's hard to remember. It's hard to process. If I asked you, what did you have for dinner last night? Might be very clear, might be very certain. It's easy to remember. It's easy to process. Things that rhyme are easy to process, are easy to remember, right? Things with clear fonts are easy to process. They feel more certain. Now, this becomes very important when it comes to things we need to believe. There's a crisis in this country where African Americans, generally speaking, do not believe health information that comes from the government. In 2002, when responding to the statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only 37% of African Americans said yes, that they agreed with that. By the time you get to 2016, that number has dropped to 18%. Now, we could do a whole other talk about why there are legit reasons African Americans have big concerns about health information coming from the government, but the fact remains this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language and big bright fonts, so be it. Now, when I was putting this into the book, my editor kind of challenged me and said, this is an interesting idea, but can you point to actual examples where clear language and pictograms have improved health outcomes? And I'm glad she pushed me on it because I found some amazing research. So women who were smoking while pregnant, right, and after they had their children, when given materials written at the 3rd grade reading level, were more likely to achieve abstinence during pregnancy, right? Stop smoking then and stop smoking 6 weeks postpartum. Similarly, people who are caretakers, right, helping people take their medicine when given a plain language pictogram-based intervention saw decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence. And you might be saying, okay, Dave, that's great for pictograms and plain language, but rhyming, really? Let me introduce you to Click It or Ticket. So a few years ago, there were laws rolled out in lots and lots of states basically saying, if you do not wear your seatbelt, you can get a ticket. And that worked, right? Especially for older drivers, but younger drivers still weren't quite catching up. So they rolled out a marketing campaign called Click It or Ticket. And the results were national belt use among young men and women, ages 16 to 24, moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. Just to put that in human terms, every percentage point you go up in people wearing their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So the rough math is that around 4,000 lives were saved in part by rhyming, which sounds silly, but it works. This whole easy to process thing even extends to name pronunciation. There's a name pronunciation effect where if your name is easier to pronounce, you're probably going to have it pretty easy. And this could be for voting preferences, for getting a job. And with the context that name pronunciation is culturally sensitive, right? So in some cultures, Smith is easier to pronounce. In other cultures, Bimu is easier to pronounce. But if your name is easier to pronounce in that culture, you got it made. In fact, they looked at a law firm. And across law firms, they noticed that as you went up the chain, the names got easier to pronounce. This even extends to stocks, right? Let's say you have an IPO. If the name of the company is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. Even if the little abbreviation, that stock ticker thing, if that's easier to pronounce, the stock tends to perform better. We will lay down cash money on things that are easier to process. Now, the most dangerous bias in the world, for my money, is the framing effect. And it starts out pretty innocently. Let's say that you are at a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean, and another sign that says beef 5% fat. Which one do you think people are going to go for? It's the same thing, right? But I've framed one of them in a way that makes it seem more appealing. Now, this is all good and well when we're talking about beef, but what if I said, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? See what I did there? We're no longer discussing whether or not it's a good idea to go to war in the first place. And wars have been started over less. Now, if you're a bilingual, multilingual, you have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you think about the question in your non-native language, you are less likely to fall for the scam. So if I think about the beef decision in French, I speak a little bit of French, I might say, okay, beef, that's boeuf, that's a lot of vowels. 95%, that's 89, I think, right? And by the time I've done all that processing, right, I see through the scam. I've had to slow down my thinking in order to think about it in my non-native language. And that's the point. Biases happen when we're thinking way too quickly, right? When we get to slow down our thinking, we tend to see through it. Daniel Kahneman wrote about this in Thinking Fast and Slow. You can actually use the framing effect for good. So there's an experiment where you show a photo like this to an audience and you ask, should this person drive this car? And what you get is a policy discussion. And some people will say, old people are bad at everything, don't let them drive. And other people might say, oh, that's ageist. People should be able to do what they want. And all you're going to learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. You can show the same photo to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? Right? And some people will say, oh, what if we move the steering wheel? And other people will say, well, what if we change the shape of the dashboard? Right? And what you'll learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. Now, all I did was change a couple words, but by changing the frame of the conversation, I've changed the entire conversation. In fact, I could iris out even further and say, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why he was in the car in the first place, to go somewhere. And if I frame it this way, things like public transportation are on the table. You can see this play out in the world of academics, where women and people of color generally are rated more poorly on student evaluations of teachers than their white male counterparts. And so the University of Iowa did an experiment where they had a couple paragraphs at the beginning of the survey that basically explained this, right? And said, hey, women are treated unfairly in this usually. Make sure when you do your evaluation, you're evaluating real things and not things like appearance, right? So the students who got those paragraphs before they filled out the survey tended to rate female professors higher than the ones who didn't. I want to finish by talking about our own cognitive biases, right? Because these are the ones that can really get our users in trouble. Notational bias is a big one. And you can see this play out in sheet music. I had to learn how to play this when I was a kid. I learned how to play saxophone. So I had to learn how to read music like this. And I came to believe that any music in the world, if you could write it down like this, I'd be able to play it, right? Except here's the thing. There's lots of music, like Asian music and African music, that simply doesn't work. You can't write it down as this Western notation. And if you make this the standard, you completely eliminate all sorts of culture. Same thing happens when people are creating forms that ask for personal information, right? If in my head, when I'm creating this, there's only two genders, right? And I create it this way, I'm going to eliminate so many different identities. Now, while we're on the topic of asking for personal information, you should know about a thing called self-serving bias. And it's a pretty straightforward bias. Basically, if something goes wrong, that's your fault. If something goes right, that's my fault, right? Pretty straightforward. And it plays out with computers too. If you're doing a transaction on a computer and something goes wrong, you blame the computer. If something goes right, you blame yourself. Unless you've given that computer lots of personal information. The more personal information you give the computer, the more likely you are to blame the computer if something goes right and yourself if something goes wrong. So for many other reasons, but this one too, we need to be very careful and very thoughtful about how often we ask for personal information in these interfaces, because we could be creating a very unhealthy dynamic between people and their technology. This one always breaks my heart. Until 1986, the New York Times prohibited the use of Ms. as an honorific for women. And the way that would work is at the first mention of a woman's name, you would say her full name. At every subsequent mention, you would say either Miss last name or Mrs. last name. And the pattern, and remember how important patterns are, the pattern this would set up is the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she's married, and then maybe her last name, right? So imagine this pattern being set up year over year for like 100 years in these articles. And this is why we need to be very careful how we structure content, because that's a very easy way to scale bias. As Mbimbo Gogomo says, language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And this is legally true. If you look back at the Bush-Cheney years, Dick Cheney becomes vice president. He wants to know what he can get away with. He talks to his lawyers who are very smart, and they say, hey, look, you are the vice president, which means you are a member of the executive branch. But you are also the person who casts the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, which means you are also part of the legislative branch. But wait a minute, you can't be both a part of the executive branch and the legislative branch. So maybe you're not a part of either. And if you're not a part of either, maybe you don't have to follow the rules of either. And he didn't, right? We say the same thing play out today with software like Facebook, right? When it suits them, they say they're a publisher. Hey, we're Facebook, come publish with us. New York Times, come publish with us. We get you. As soon as someone points out that there's rules for publishers, all of a sudden Facebook's like, well, I don't know what you heard, buddy. We're a platform. Now, there are tools out there to help us think about language for people who usually don't get a say in how they're written about. One of them is Radical Copy Editor and has great tools for thinking about that. Another one is called Textio, and it's especially good for writing job descriptions that are more inclusive because not everybody wants to be a rock star or a ninja. Another term we can think about is called evidentiality, and it's something that other languages have, but English, not so much. In English, we use our verb tense to basically tell you when something happened. Bob went to the store, Bob is going to the store, Bob will go to the store, right? Other languages like Turkish make their verb tense do a little more heavy lifting, and they tell you how I know that Bob went to the store. So there's one verb tense for I saw Bob go to the store. There's another verb tense for somebody told me Bob went to the store. And then maybe another one for I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. The point is, I can't tell you Bob went to the store without also telling you how I know Bob went to the store. Now think about that, right? What if you were on the hook for how you knew about something every time you said something, every time you posted it to Facebook, every time a news outlet did it, every time a politician did it, right? That would be a powerful thing. Now, English does not have this as a mandatory thing, but I think as designers and creators, we can think about ways to bring it back. Before, when I was saying that it's something easier to read, if something is easier to read, it's more believable. It works in reverse too. If something is harder to read, it feels less believable. Now, this is an actual article from, I don't know, a year ago when the first trailer for the 007 film dropped, right? And the first paragraph is confirmable facts. This is who's in it. This is what it's called. The second paragraph is a rumor about why the first director was fired, right? First paragraph, pretty easy to read, pretty believable. Second paragraph, kind of hard to read, not as believable, and it shouldn't be, it's a rumor. So I think we can play with ways to signal to our users just how believable things really are. Told you we'd come back to this. So for a long time, I did not really get how the scientific method worked. I thought it was, I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to do an experiment, see if I'm right, if I like the results. All y'all try the exact same thing. If you get the same result, great, that's a law, let's call it a day. The actual method, after talking to some real scientists, goes more like this. I have an idea about how the world works. I do an experiment, see if I'm right. If I am, all y'all try the same thing. If you get a good result, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true, and then go and try and prove that. That's much more rigorous, and it was created specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, it is remarkably easy for us to leave good design on the table, to miss a more elegant solution because we fall in love with our first idea. Let me show you how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game with a computer, and the computer is going to give us these numbers and that question mark and say, hey, put whatever number you want where that question mark is, and I'll tell you if it fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you think you know the pattern, tell me what you think it is. If you're like me, you try 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, hold my beer, I got this. I know the pattern. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says, no. The reason it says no is because I didn't try this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is simply that every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution, probably easier to code, probably cheaper for your client or your company, right? But I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are tools out there to help us avoid that trap. One of them is called red team, blue team. And the basic idea is that you have a blue team who does the research, maybe comes up with the prototype, but before you really commit to anything, the red team comes in for one day. And their job is to go to war with the blue team, right? And they're there to find every hidden assumption, every more elegant solution, every potential cause of harm that the blue team didn't see because they were so in love with their first idea. Now, I like this approach because it's fairly economical, right? I don't have to go to my COO and say, hey, from now on, we've got to spin up 2 teams for every single project and got to check each other's work every day. No, I need one team for one day to make it a little less likely that we put something harmful out into the world. Another great tool for this is called Speculative Design, right? And it's kind of like Black Mirror. You think up a near future technology and you tell a story about how it would play out if you put it in the hands of real human beings. And the answer is always terrible. I honestly think anybody working on a new technology should have to write a Black Mirror episode by law. But this is a real job. Superflex went down to the United Arab Emirates to help them figure out the future of energy. And the question on the table was, should they continue down the path of fossil fuels or should they invest in renewables? What Superflex did was they figured out what the air quality was going to be like 10 years out, 20 years out, if they continued down the path of fossil fuels. But they didn't just figure it out. They bottled it, right? And then they made them breathe it. And once you get to about 10 years out, it is unbreathable. By the end of that engagement, the UAE announced they were going to invest $150 billion in renewables. Another cool thing you can do is an assumption audit. And it's a way to get your biases out on the table before you begin a project. And the way it works is you get your team in a room on day one and you ask these questions. What identities does your team represent? And you only self-identify as you feel comfortable, but think about things like gender, race, income, neurodiversity, and so on. And then you ask, how might these identities influence the design of this experience? Then you ask, what identities are not represented here, right? Hey, anybody here ever been incarcerated? Anyone here ever had their immigration status questioned, right? Then you ask, how might that absence of perspective, right? How might not having those voices present affect the outcome of this engagement? And finally, you ask, how might we include, honor, and give power to those perspectives in our design process? This can be a powerful way to frame, right, the beginning and the outcome of a project. The last bias I want to talk about is called déformation professionnelle. I told you I speak French. And it is basically a bias where you see the entire world through the lens of your job, which in the workaholic world we live in may seem like a good idea until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road that night probably thought they were doing a good job. And technically speaking, they were. They were getting very difficult to get photographs that were going to fetch them a very high price. Now, what they weren't doing such a great job at was being human beings. Now, I think about 3 police commissioners ago, Chief Ramsey, when he became police commissioner of Philadelphia, asked his officers, what do you think your job is? And many of them would answer, to enforce the law. And he said, okay, seems like a reasonable answer, but what if I were to tell you your job is to protect civil rights? Now that encompasses enforcing the law, but it's a bigger job. It's a harder job because it means you have to treat people with dignity. You can't just shoot them because they're black. Now, I've had this slide in here since 2017. And obviously this year, this slide has taken on a even bigger awareness than before. And I get much more emotional on this slide than I used to. It was only, 2-3 days ago, we learned Breonna Taylor's killers are not going to see justice. So I keep this in here, though, because now more than ever, it's clear that how we define our jobs is a matter of life and death. Ramsey was telling his officers, your jobs are harder than you think. And I am telling us, our jobs are harder than we think. It isn't just design cool shit. We have to come up with a way to define our jobs that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, there are people working on this. Mike Montero over at Mule Design has a red book of design ethics. And it's basically a Hippocratic oath for designers, right? A first do no harm, with little gems like a designer is first and foremost a human being. You've got the Design Justice Network, who is doing amazing work and has these amazing set of 10 principles. I'm just going to read you the first 2. We use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. We center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. Now, if you just look at those first 2 principles and try to adhere to them, you've got your work cut out for you. And it's the difference between what Erica Hall calls user-centered design versus shareholder-centered design. And we often think we're doing the former when we're actually doing the latter. There are tools out there to help us with this. Ethics has been studied for over 2,000 years, right? We can use their learnings for frameworks to ask ourselves the right questions. So you have the Mercula Center for Ethical Design is some great resources here. So you have which option will produce the most good and do the least harm. That's the utilitarian approach. Which option leads me to act as the sort of person I want to be? That's called the virtue approach, right? All these tools are there for us. Tarot cards of tech is a great intervention for this. You go to the site and you see these cards and you click on them and they flip around and they give you these really provocative questions about your product. How might cultural habits change how your product is used? And how might your product change cultural habits? If Twitter had asked itself this before it launched, maybe we'd see a different world today. Software engineers are getting in on this, right? You have the Never Again Pledge, which was signed by hundreds and thousands of data engineers and data scientists when people started asking them to do some pretty unethical stuff with data, especially around immigration. And they pointed to this long sordid history of data being used to do terrible things and said, we don't want to be a part of that. And they created this pledge. They started looking at things like collective action. And stuff like that's playing out at places like Google, where you had Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI. And software engineers at Google said, we did not get into this business to build weapons. So we're going to walk, right, if you keep doing this. And Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million contract with the military. And then they turned right around and did Dragonfly, which is a censored search thing in China. That battle is still being fought. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. This is not some software guru at a TED Talk. This is Martin Luther King, right? Over 50 years ago, he saw this, and it's only more true today. So the challenge I will give all of us is how might we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you. So I don't know if we have time for questions or if people want to drop them into chat, but happy to do that. And thank you, Carolina, for posting a link to the book. You can buy more than one copy of the book. And in fact, if you at 10, discount automatically kicks in. So if you want to buy one for your team, go for it. Julie's having trouble hopping back in, so if folks want to drop their questions into the chat, I'll read them out here. Dave asks, what's the first best step to calling out and identifying cognitive biases in the workplace? So those processes I was talking about at the end, so the red team, blue team, the speculative design, the assumption audit, these are all great ways to kind of catch yourself, because like I said, even if you know about the bias, you might still repeat it. But if you can bring in other perspectives, people with their own biases that are different from yours, that can kind of make it easier to catch those things before they cause harm. And I think the important thing to remember is that if you want these things to be sustainable, you have to get them in the budget. I come from a world where, if it's not in the budget, it's very hard to guarantee it's going to happen. Like, I think that's true in corporate culture everywhere, in agency side, client side. If it's not in the budget, it kind of doesn't exist. I think people are familiar with that idea. So I think a good idea is to start small with something like an assumption audit, where you're really only going to have to ask for like an hour or 2 hours out of an entire project's budget to do that work. And if that goes well, then you can say, okay, well, can we get red team day on the audit? So now I go from asking for a couple hours, now I'm asking for a day, but it's still maybe 1 day out of a 600 day, or say 60 day project, right? But it's important that it be in the budget, because that's really how a company shows its commitment to a thing, and how you can be sure it's actually going to keep happening. What do you suggest employers unfamiliar with DEI do to begin to learn about bias? I am not going to claim to be a DEI expert. There's some great ones out there. I like Zoe Kwok over at ComClarity. Michael Bryan is a good one. I can, offline, I can give you plenty of recommendations of folks who I think are really good at this work. And that's a very specific, I don't want to say niche, but a specific flavor of thinking about bias. That does sort of cover some of the stuff I'm talking about, but it is more about interpersonal relationships. And honestly, a lot of that comes down to awareness of your own emotions, right? It's almost like therapy and understanding, like, when, again, here's a study, when white people are confronted with race, or a black person walks in the room or whatever, like, their heart rate actually goes up, right? So there's these physiological reactions we have. And until you can sort of like deal with that piece, it doesn't actually help to start talking about race, because people have their hackles up. So we've been working with someone named Zoe Kwok, who's helping us think through things like dealing with the neurological aspects, neuropsychology of race first, before you try to engage with, okay, now let's start having that conversation. That's a mistake a lot of people make, is trying to jump into that conversation before they've really done the work to understand how even their own bodies are reacting. But that would be, if you're specifically talking about DEI work from a cultural perspective, I would focus on the professionals who do that work. If Google chooses not to make a terrible thing, will someone else just make it? I do market research and I've tested some stuff that wasn't my favorite, but the work still needed to get done. Is tough, but not always a binary choice, or is it? Thanks. So I think that honestly comes down to to be perfectly honest, it's kind of like a how do you sleep at night kind of question, because yes, someone is probably going to do a bad thing. Does that mean you want to be the one to do it? Or do you think that it will somehow be less bad if you're the one who does it? I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but I feel like at the end of the day, it is very difficult to predict the future. It is very difficult to know how that's going to play out. It's also very difficult to know that if you don't do the bad thing and you do the right thing, if your right thing actually isn't going to make the bad thing less bad if and when it comes out, right? To be very simplistic, if there's like 5 people doing a good thing and one person decides, well, I'm going to do the bad thing, that's different than if one person decides to do a bad thing and no one's even thought to do any good things, right? So even from just a numbers perspective, you want more people working on good things than bad things, even if you know there are going to be people working on bad things. Think about CRISPR, for example. CRISPR is a gene editing technology, and people are very worried about it for very good reasons. But it's one of the few innovations where, as it has grown up, ethics teams have been part of the actual research teams, people doing the scientific work about this. Like, actual ethicists are working on this, which, thank God, right? Yes, I can guarantee you there are going to be governments out there who are going to want to work on it in ways that aren't ethical. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't. And we're going to be probably better at fighting whatever crazy crap they come up with if we have been doing the ethical work first. So I would say if it's a choice between doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing, even if you're sure someone else is going to do the wrong thing, I would still want to be on the side of the angels, just even on general principle, but also, frankly, because when the wrong thing does eventually come out, I want some right things out there to fight it. Resources, ways, work is, calm clarity. She does really good stuff. I'm trying to see if there's any more questions. I think we still have a few more minutes. Looking back. Okay, so I don't see any other questions. I'm going to put my website in here and in the chat. So if anyone wants to follow up later, you can hire me to talk there. I do an inclusive design workshop through Think Company that can help you get your feet wet around any of this stuff. So we're happy to do that. And you can buy my book. Well, the link's already there, but there's also a link on the website. So I'm going to drop that in real quick. Julia's asking for a tweet length takeaway. What's a good one? So the tweet is this, but I'll unpack it. The tweet is, there is no such thing as neutral design. All right. And what I mean by that is kind of going back to that, do the right thing, do the wrong thing question is, you can say, oh, isn't this all manipulation? Right? Like, should I even be touching this stuff? The problem is there's nothing you can do that isn't manipulation, right? As a designer or just someone who makes things. Like, if I were to put a random assortment of things on a web page, you would still start to read into it. It would still start to affect your behavior. Even because of a thing called primacy, where the first thing you see, you assume is more important than the second thing you see. That's going to happen no matter what I put on that page. But if I know that, I'm now responsible for at least trying to put something helpful as the first thing and something less helpful as the second thing, right? So we can't get away from this issue, right? Whether we're, intending to do the wrong thing or not, anything we do is going to have an impact. So we might as well try to do the right thing. I guess that would be my final takeaway. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a great day. And again, feel free to reach out if you have more questions.